today with Jeanette Esbrook. She's a civil rights attorney and vice president of legal affairs at the Women's Clearinghouse on Women's Issues, one of the oldest women's organizations. Hi, it's so nice to see you today.
Hi, Anne. Nice to see you.
I'd like to start with what inspired you. What inspired you to take this journey?
The journey in civil rights.
Yes.
I guess it was the second women's movement in the 70s. I was a trained scientist, actually a medical geneticist, and after raising 2 kids, I thought I would go back and complete my studies in genetics. But in the meantime, the women's movement of the second women's movement of the 70s happened, and the peace movement, all the civil rights during that period, and I got real involved. I was living in the state of Delaware, which is a very small state, and in that state you can get involved very easily and very quickly. So I decided to go to law school instead of going back to graduate school and finishing my studies in genetics, and became a civil rights lawyer.
So, what were some of the who were some of the people who inspired you? Is what I wanted to ask. Who really paved the way for you? Or
I actually had a mentor in Delaware. She was the chair of the Women's Governor's Commission on the Status of Women. Every state had such a commission in the 70s, and I was vice chair. She was what is known as a convener of NOW for the state, and was very experienced with the women's movement, and I was pretty naive. She inspired me, as did Betty Friedan. In 1972, when I started my first job after raising children, my daughter was in middle school and my son was in elementary school. So my first job was in 1972 when I worked at the University of Delaware, and it was the first issue of Ms. Magazine that I read.
Yeah.
Helen Reddy was top of the charts. I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar, and Numbers Too Big to Ignore. It was a very inspirational time.
Yeah.
And I went to law school and decided I would like to work in Washington. There was so much going on in D.C., and I was fortunate enough to be hired in the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare in 1979, which eventually became the Department of Education and the Department of Health and Human Services. And I was hired in the General Counsel in HEW. And my client was the Office for Civil Rights. When the Department of Education was created, then I was assigned as an attorney to the Office for Civil Rights. But in 79 and 80, their Title IX of the 1972 Civil Rights Act was becoming very active in the athletic field, although it was passed originally to look at equity for women in jobs, professions, general education. It became important in the field of athletics when I was first hired, and the new issue was women participating in intercollegiate athletics. There was some experience with high school athletics, but it was, and there were some gains for girls to have experience in sports, because it was limited. The NCAA did not have a women's did not have women participate. It was all men. So when I was hired, I joined a group of women attorneys, and we were charged with the responsibility to develop the policy on implementing intercollegiate athletics, and we did. And we applied that with some degree of temerity, because none of us had a lot of extensive experience in athletics. Not too many women did at that time.
Yeah.
I mean, after all, we were playing half-court basketball. I don't know if people remember that. The guard stayed on one half of the court, forward stayed on the other half.
Yeah.
That's the way basketball was played for women. In any event, it was a monumental effort. And in fact, I met my 6'5" husband, who was a former basketball player and an investigator.
It's fantastic.
And now we are married 40 years. But so Title IX became a very important aspect of the civil rights laws, as did Title VI, prohibiting discrimination based on race, national origin. Language minority and the learning of English for immigrants was an important aspect for me.
You're talking about Title IX.
Yes, and it was in the context of Bunny Sandler. Bunny was one of the women who inspired me to become a civil rights attorney. As a matter of fact, one of my greatest achievements in litigation was as a Department of Justice attorney litigating the entrance of women in a state military academy. 20 years after the Army, the Navy, the Air Force Academy had allowed women to enter their training programs, their colleges and universities, the Virginia Military Academy and the Citadel in South Carolina prevented women from entering their schools, their universities, even though these universities were publicly funded by taxes paid by women and men.
Right.
The Justice Department attorneys, I was one of them, decided that under the 14th Amendment and Title IX, we had to stop that practice. And with the help of the Supreme Court, they determined that it was a violation of the 14th Amendment and Title IX not to allow these women to enter their academies. So as part of the Citadel team, we were able to get women to enroll in the Citadel in South Carolina. That was one of our achievements. In addition to the athletic access to athletics, and although you think about women in athletics, you think, well, it's just sports. It's more than that. It's learning how to compete. It's learning how to lose as well as win.
Right.
And to face competition, and to do so in a way that doesn't make you fall apart, that you continue to be a leader. So a lot of skills have been learned by more women because of athletic experience.
Absolutely. Right. Thank you. I'm also very interested in the obstacles that you face today compared to the obstacles that you faced in the 70s.
This time has been a very big challenge, because the achievements of the 70s and the 80s and 90s have been really challenged in many ways, I'm afraid to say, successfully.
Mhm.
One of the issues that I worked on extensively was sexual harassment. And in the 80s, the term sexual harassment wasn't even developed. Nobody really knew what it was. And I was assigned a case that involved a college and university where a financial aid officer at a university in the Midwest had young women sit on his lap while he inquired as to their eligibility for funds.
Wow.
And that woman, that young woman, was very upset by that. She wanted her funds, she wanted her loan, her student aid help, but she didn't like having to sit on his lap every time she went in there to provide her eligibility information. And she filed a complaint with our local civil rights office, and they came to headquarters and said, what do I do with this complaint? And I had worked at a university before, and I knew what sexual harassment was. At universities, at the university I worked at, which I understand in retrospect, it wasn't that much different. There was a lot of what eventually became known as sexual harassment going on. And I was sexually harassed at that university without really knowing it.
Mm.
But I felt I understood what it was. It wasn't sex. It was power.
Exactly.
It
Yes.
was power and using that power.
Right.
So we worked hard to understand it, and the word developed. Not only was the Department of Education, the Office for Civil Rights, the Labor Department, the EEOC, we were all looking into these matters, and the term, excuse me, sexual harassment was adopted.
Mhm.
And we issued guidance on how sexual harassment should be investigated, and it was a very difficult investigation for our investigators. It always became a he said, she said,
Right.
and a lot of women were embarrassed. They didn't know they were embarrassed to even complain about it.
Mhm.
And there was a lot of things like going to parties and losing control, but still wanting to say no as a woman, but not being heard as a no. But how do you explain that? So over the years, and it took a long time, we finally got the law, the Me Too movement, and regulations and guidance were developed, so it became more equal footing in terms of the sexual harassment survivor and the harasser. But since the new administration, the Trump administration, came in, they decided that they were going to obliterate the most recent Biden guidance,
Yeah.
and reinstate President Trump's earlier term guidance under Betsy DeVos, who was the Secretary of Education. And to our horror, the work that we had developed through the Me Too movement, through people's more sensitivity to how difficult it is for women who survive, women and men who survive harassment.
Right. That's right. Right.
It's an affront on your personhood,
Mhm.
and it's hard to admit that I gave in or I didn't know what to do, and I was taken advantage of. It's always difficult to admit to that, and
Yeah.
in any event, with all that work that we accomplished, it's now been thrown out, and we're back to the previous guidance.
Which is heartbreaking. So I'm really interested in what not just what women should do, but men also for their wives, their daughters, their sisters. What can we do at this point? You've been fighting a battle for such a long time.
Right.
It's a setback, but I certainly don't think it's the end. I think we should still, more than ever, soldier on.
Right, and I think there are a lot of people who are waking up to that. There was a lot of passivity for a while, and now that it's starting to be challenged and taken away, the demonstrations that have occurred across the country just recently, and I got out my energy and went out and demonstrated at my age just like I used to in the 70s.
Fantastic.
It was great. But what we can do is there are some lawsuits that are being filed, and we need to, there are lawsuits that require, they're called mandamus lawsuits. It's a legal term. And it means like mandate.
Yeah.
And it means government, do your job. What kind of a job?
Exactly.
And that's what we're afraid of.
Yeah, yeah.
We want to say to the current OCR, to the current Department of Justice, do your job, and then we're doing so with, oh my God, what job are they going to do?
Right, right.
So we want to file a lawsuit or support a current lawsuit because there are many. And we're grateful to see, I'm grateful to see that there are so many, that we can join the lawsuit or file what's called an amicus to support the lawsuit, and to say, OCR, do your job, and here are the standards that you should use, not what you've said in your recent Dear Colleague letter,
Right.
which set out a standard that went far beyond what the Supreme Court has given them authority to do. And I know it's in the area of wish list, but that's how I felt when I started athletics, when I worked on sexual harassment, when I worked on trying to get women into the military academies. It's something that you have to try, and unless you step up and try it.
I was curious, could you tell me a little about your childhood?
I'm a child of immigrants from China, from Guangzhou, and as a child in my household, I spoke Chinese. And it wasn't until I was 5 and I went to school as a kindergartner and learned English. I was raised in a very traditional Chinese family where discipline, education, fealty to your parents and your background were very, very important. And I grew up in the 50s and 60s, was a very good student, and went to the University of Michigan. I was raised in Detroit, Michigan, and went to the State University. And in the time, in the 60s, a lot of the women who were going to get university degrees were in universities to look for husbands, not necessarily to find a career.
Right.
I was in a sorority, and one of the biggest achievements was when you got engaged. Well, when I got married, I married a very successful Chinese American young man who I had met in Chinese school in Detroit, and we went to the University of Michigan together and decided that we were going to have get married and have a family. And our parents were very, very happy. We were doing exactly what they had in mind for us.
Right.
And we ended up in Wilmington, Delaware, where my husband at the time was hired to be a research and eventually an executive in the DuPont company. And even though I had achieved a master's degree in medical genetics with a professor who eventually won a Nobel Prize
Wow.
with DNA research,
Wow.
I became a dutiful DuPont housewife. Played duplicate bridge, cooked progressive dinners, and then the 70s happened.
Mm-hmm.
It was happening all along.
Mm-hmm.
I had read Betty Friedan's book, Germaine Greer's book, Ms. Magazine, and I think my husband must have gotten whiplash trying to figure out what had happened to his dutiful wife.
I bet he did.
And then when I said, I'm going to law school, I think that was the last straw.
Right.
And we separated. I went to law school, and you got the rest of the story.
Right.
That's how it all happened.
Right.
A very short story. But my parents were very supportive.
Which is great, because your career path is a career path of a very strong, outspoken woman. Was that something that was acceptable to them?
Well, particularly my father. My father had immigrated to the United States when he was a teenager, and my mother didn't immigrate until she was trying to escape the Japanese. She was, during the time, men who, and he was in California, men who came to the United States could not bring their wives. So they had a separate,
Incredible,
it
yeah.
was. And most of my siblings, 3 of my 5 siblings, were born in China. And my sister and I were born in the United States after Mom immigrated in 1939 after, just to try and get out of China because the Japanese were invading. But my dad was more of a modern person. And I'll never forget how, when I tried to explain to my parents, particularly my dad, that I was going to get a divorce and I was going to go to law school, he knew immediately what was happening, because he had taught himself how to read by reading newspapers, and he read newspapers all his life.
Mm-hmm.
So he was pretty much up on what was happening, and he said, I understand. Now I've got to explain it to your mother. And of course my mother always thought she was going to go back to China. So she never wanted to learn English.
Mm.
So I have achieved all these degrees with a mother who never learned English.
Interesting.
And my
Yeah.
father who taught himself how to read by reading newspapers.
So you definitely have that determination, I think, from your dad. Wow, what a great family. Tell me about your kids.
Well, right now we're getting ready to celebrate a grandchild.
Oh, wonderful.
The one of 2 sons of my son, and he's about to get a PhD in artificial intelligence, math development, computers, from the Carnegie Mellon School, and he's going to graduate with the PhD in May. I'm a little concerned with what's happening with the future of the continuing education of young people, because under the current administration there's a lot of censorship and inability for people to learn about the history of our country and the history of Title IX, and even the funding of programs like at Carnegie Mellon, Columbia University, even Harvard. I'm going to a board meeting this coming weekend at the University of Michigan, where I went to school, and they're concerned because they have lost a lot of federal grants. And they're worried about how can we support students like my grandsons and their continuing education, which up until now has been very good.
Right.
So the future, what I would want to say is that it can get very depressing when you learn about executive orders that stop one thing after another, and you want to read about fantasy, see movies that take you out of the reality, and avoid reading newspapers or learning about what's happening. And I would hope people step up and do something. Don't be depressed. Do something. Go to a demonstration. Help somebody learn about Black history or Title IX. Just don't get depressed with what's happening. And as Cory Booker said, I had to do something.
Exactly. That is really wonderful. If you had to speak to a group of young people right now, is there anything particular that you would want to say?
Yeah, dream big. Just don't think you cannot do it, and don't be distracted or deterred by failure. In my life of 80 plus years, I've learned that you learn more from your failures than you do from your successes. And I don't think young people know that.
People in general, it's scary to fail. It's frightening.
It is.
It's really scary. But you're right. It takes a long time to learn that lesson.
Right.
But if you just dive in and go after something, and you overcome whatever failure you had, you definitely come out on top every time. It's just so hard to, it's like jumping off a cliff.
Well, in retrospect, you said, oh, okay, I learned not to do that again.
Right. Exactly. Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. This has really been fascinating. Did we leave anything out? Is there anything particular that you would want to say?
You know, there's a lot in my life of 80 years. And I do want to say that friendships and relationships are far more important than degrees and achievements. I've learned that too.
Yeah, it sustains us, doesn't it?
It sure does.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. This is really fascinating. I enjoyed every
I
minute of it.
enjoyed it too.
Thank